few months at most.
Yeah. I hope so.
Yeah, I think so because food's already. Okay.
Yeah.
You're gonna learn Portuguese very quickly because it depends on how much bars you will visit.
Okay.
You intend to visit, because there is the place where you can learn
Probably.
faster Portuguese.
Yeah.
Alô. Quando você me avisar, aí eu... Foi? Ok? Shall we? Right? Boa noite a todas e todos. Aqui hoje para o nosso primeiro seminário da sequência de seminários organizada pelo Departamento de Ciência Política da USP, e é com um enorme prazer que a gente começa hoje o ano de 2024 recebendo a professora Ina Kerner. And Ina, I will introduce you briefly in Portuguese, and then we can start. I switch to English, all right? And professora de Ciência Política no Departamento de Estudos Culturais da Universidade de Koblenz. Foi pesquisadora convidada em diversas instituições internacionalmente reconhecidas de ensino e de pesquisa. E, atualmente, Ina Kerner é Fellow Senior no Maria Sibylla Merian Center, Conviviality Inequality, em Latin America, o MESILA, que tem sede aqui na USP e também sede no SEBRAP, aqui em São Paulo. Então, estamos muito contentes em receber a Ina durante alguns meses deste ano como pesquisadora Senior Fellow. Sua pesquisa está localizada na interface entre teoria crítica, teoria política, estudos de gênero e estudos culturais. Mais especificamente, seus trabalhos têm procurado introduzir perspectivas teóricas pós-coloniais na teoria política, incluindo debates teóricos políticos sobre fenômenos como democracia e migração, por exemplo. Uma outra preocupação básica de suas pesquisas está voltada para o campo da teoria feminista transdisciplinar e para questões e perspectivas interseccionais. Atualmente, ela está envolvida em uma investigação dedicada à crítica feminista da religião em um mundo pós-secular e heterogêneo. Ina Kerner tem diversas publicações, livros, artigos acadêmicos em suas áreas de pesquisa. Eu destaco aqui apenas 2 de seus livros autorais publicados originalmente na Alemanha. O primeiro, publicado em 2009, Diferenças e Poder, sobre a anatomia do racismo e do sexismo, e um outro livro, publicado em 2012, que se chama Teorias Pós-Coloniais. Entre outras muitas publicações, aqui a lista seria muito grande. Hoje, a professora Ina Kerner vai apresentar uma conferência que tem o título Solidarity in Constellations of Inequality, a Postcolonial Studies View. So, Professor Ina Kerner, we from the Department of Political Science, we are very grateful that you accept our invitation for the first conference of this year. So, please, thanks.
Muito obrigada. The one who's super grateful is me for the invitation, but also for the humbling introduction. Estoy super feliz de estar aquí. Aprendo portugués, pero todavía no les puedo saludar en portugués. Quizás un día, o espero que un día, hasta ahora puedo pedir 2 aguas minerales. Eso no sirve para una charla académica, pero estoy súper feliz de estar acá y, bueno, al menos en castellano puedo decir eso, pero voy a cambiar a inglés para la ponencia misma. Y necesito otros lentes. Con la edad se pasa. The starting points of this lecture, which, as you had seen in the slide before, is sort of a reflection on what solidarity could mean in constellations of inequality from a postcolonial studies perspective, is different things. These were supposed to, well, anyway. So there is, in a way, I would say, a boom at the moment, at least in Germany, in debates on solidarity. There have been numerous conferences, workshops, books, and even research projects, collaborative research projects. And actually, I've been invited to one of these workshops, which is, and gave the German version of this talk there 2 years ago. So that was sort of immediate, in a way, starting point for this. Most of the work, I would say, that is appearing in these different venues that I've just mentioned is characterized by what I would call methodological nationalism and is focused on European contexts. And this paper is, in a way, an attempt at a shift in perspective, trying to integrate or to put forward a post-colonial studies view on solidarity, which includes both global aspects and forms of solidarity, as well as solidarity in contexts shaped by coloniality and inequality. The motivation to write this paper was trying to think through some of my own experiences while living in contexts of great inequality, namely the ones you see in the slide, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Pakistan during the last 30 years. And I mean, everybody who has spent some time in a different context than the ones they've been familiarized with or grown up with knows that if you are confronted with a different normality, you sometimes see things that otherwise you don't sort of realize as striking. The paper is part of a larger project on post-colonial political theory that, I mean, this what I present today. Rurion said this already, and also of my Mesila project. In my Mesila project, I want to focus on different topics from a post-colonial studies perspective, so this is sort of the very preliminary version of one of the chapters I'd like to write. So I'm actually particularly curious about what you will say and what you will find helpful and also maybe questionable of what I present. The paper I present came out in German, and you can see the reference there. What I will do is consisting in 6 parts. There are actually 5 fragments and then sort of a conclusion. I will speak first on Frantz Fanon, on colonial reparations, then on development cooperation and the problems that it often comes with, namely of paternalism, or some people say imperialism. I will speak about the complex relation of solidarity and charity, of solidarity grounded in dialogue, and solidarity as a model of coalition, and then comes the end. And I have a text which I will read, and basically the most important things of the chapters and different parts you will find in the slides. Frantz Fanon is a key figure in post-colonial theory. In his book, The Damned of the Earth, published in 1961, he deals with the mechanisms and effects of colonialism, as well as with the perspectives, strategies, and difficulties of decolonization. In this book, there is a chapter, or rather a few paragraphs, that can be read as a demand for global solidarity, at least if one understands solidarity in the moral philosophical sense as a duty to help, an obligation to provide assistance. The topic of the named chapter is the aftermath of global inequality produced by colonialism. Fanon first outlines the precarious starting position of young post-colonies, especially the lack of basic infrastructure, not least in education and healthcare. He then contrasts this lack with the wealth and abundance of Europe, an abundance he considers, quote, literally scandalous, because it was, quote again, built on the backs of slaves and came in direct line from the soil and earth of this underdeveloped world, end of quote. According to Fanon, positive change of this constellation requires massive resources, and this is where reparations come in. Quote again, colonialism and imperialism are not even with us when they have withdrawn their flags and their police forces from our territories, he declares. For the wealth of imperialist countries is also our wealth. Against this backdrop, Fanon ascribes to reparations, whose model for him is the compensation payments Germany made for Nazi crimes, a moral purpose, in addition to their material function. They reinforce, quote again, the colonized in the consciousness that they are owed something, and the capitalist powers in the realization that they must pay. The normative basis of this demand, which can be said to have a high degree of topicality against the background of current debates about colonial reparations, is a profound humanism, which in Fanon's case should be understood in terms of a radical rejection of the colonial tradition of racial thinking, especially with regard to the dehumanizing ideas about black people that characterize this thinking. Quote, man must be restored to his rights, man must finally and once and for all triumph everywhere in the world, he declares. Since he considers it unlikely that European governments will embrace this goal, he appeals to the European masses for its realization. With regard to colonialism, these masses had thus far been mostly allied with the wrong side, namely with the masters, of themselves as well as of the colonized. Therefore, they would finally have to, one more quote, give up their irresponsible slumber once and for all. The European masses, today one would probably rather say civil societies, are thus, at least in practical terms, the true addressees of his demand for solidarity. Second part, dilemmas of aid, or the danger of becoming imperial dilemmas of aid. Development aid is a field of politics and action that at first glance, or maybe at first glance from the perspective of the global north, could be considered a realization of Fanon's demand. And actually, I mean, there are reparation claims, for instance, from the Herero in Namibia, former German colony, and the German government always says, oh, but we do so much development cooperation, you know, we already do pay a lot. But if one looks at this field of development politics more closely, and in the light of the post-development literature that has been produced for decades, doubts may arise. Too often, the supposed cooperation hides a currently often neoliberal form of policy advice that follows the goals and templates of the so-called donor countries, and too much of the money spent in this context flows into maintaining its bureaucracy, into air-conditioned offices, good salaries, big houses, and SUVs of a privileged white expert class with its already significantly less privileged local staff. From such a perspective, the post-development studies perspective, the practice of development aid appears more as an extension of colonialism than an attempt to undo at least part of the colonial damage by reparations. What's more, the practice of development work presents itself, or one could even say maybe disguises itself, as transnational solidarity, as the proverbial white man's burden to take upon himself the development of the former colonies and the rest of the world. So if we follow this post-development critique, we must contend that neocolonial practices use the rhetoric of solidarity for self-justification and thus instrumentalize it. This is the opposite of what Fanon wanted. Particularly in the field of transnational feminism, which is by no means identical with the practical field of development aid, but does have large overlaps, this problem has been discussed extensively for decades. In this field, scholars as well as activists have problematized that the attempt of Western feminists to use their own privileges in favor of the least advantaged, for example, by pushing for equality-oriented development planning, often that, scholars and activists often problematize that this attempt often turns into imperialism, since such attempts have patronizing and thus ultimately hierarchizing effects, produce hierarchies. They create the scenario of benevolent actors in the global north on the one hand, and the beneficiaries in the global south on the other hand. And this happens despite the fact that such attempts try to overcome existing inequalities in the spirit of solidarity. This kind of problematization has led to demands for a strategic silence, for instance, as a solution in the context of that. And this idea is by a international relations scholar called Pratt. She formulated this in the context of the Afghanistan war, and which was legitimated or often justified, at least in Europe and the US, as an endeavor to free Afghan women from the Taliban. So her point is that this has been an instrumentalization of feminist claims, and she has therefore suggested a strategic silence on the part of Western feminists to prevent such kind of instrumentalization. So this has been suggested. Shirin Rai, who is critical of this solution, has talked about a hands-off approach to otherness, which to her has become much more and more prevalent, and in a way stopped dialogue across cultural boundaries in feminist work. With these ideas of strategic silence or hands-off, the idea is to reduce one's solidaristic action to the realm of the local to prevent unwanted global power effects, imperial ones. It may come as no surprise that this solution is also far from perfect, or is far from perfect. For the retreat of Western feminism to the terrain of its own doorstep is not necessarily perceived as an anti-imperialist gesture, or always, but sometimes also as desolidarization, and problematized accordingly. I have experienced this myself in Pakistan, where I taught in a gender studies department for a semester a few years ago, when Fazana Bari, a colleague, actually my boss, and an extremely impressive feminist scholar and activist, problematized that the intersectional and part of the post-colonial critique of the unitary collective subject of women, and that particularly the emphasis on differences in power also between women, had led to a decline in international support for her local feminist work, because people who had before allied and helped her campaign now didn't really want to dirty their hands anymore in this sort of imperial endeavor. On a similar note, at least in the German press, there have been several calls for more global feminist solidarity in the fall of 2022 in the context of the protests in Iran. And a lot of Iranian activists actually called for global feminist solidarity. That wasn't there that much, but by the Iranian diaspora community. And a third example of a critique of the hands-off approach is a book published in 2020 with the telling title, An Angry Woman, Letter from Algiers to the Indifferent Europeans. In this book, the author, Wasila Tamzali, expresses her disappointment that feminists in Europe are increasingly adopting a stance of cultural relativism that is critical of universalism, and against this backdrop refrain from a critique of the gender politics in Muslim-dominated contexts. Tamzali particularly stresses links between religious and secular anti-feminist forces, and reminds feminists in Europe that such links, which according to her cause severe problems in present-day Algeria, have once provoked a long tradition of feminist critique with reference to Christianity. And she's quite disappointed that this critique of religion is, in a way, not being voiced by Western feminists with regard to Islam. I hope that what we can learn from these voices is that hands-off is indeed often not a good solution in our global, highly complex world, at least not when there is a fundamental claim to solidarity. To restrict solidarity to the small terrain in front of one's own doorstep, to contexts that are so homogeneous that any danger of becoming imperial is excluded from the outset, can quickly turn into a denial of solidarity. The critical intention of the outlined caution would then be missed in an almost tragic way. I come to the next part on the relationship between solidarity and charity. And since I'm in a cultural studies department now, I Googled and looked what's up there on the internet and found this all rosy. Train yourself toward solidarity and not charity. You are no one's savior. You are mutual partner in the pursuit of freedom. It was just there. I forgot on which side. But it actually, of course, has an author. And the original is not rosy. But it's from an article called How to Spend Your Privilege in actually, I didn't know this journal. I don't know if you know it. It's a New York-based online magazine. The cut on it says fashion, beauty, politics, sex, and celebrity. Quite an interesting mix for political scientists, I guess. Brittany Packnett is a African-American educator, activist, influencer, and she wrote this article, How to Spend Your Privilege. And these are a few quotes of this. The article is actually not funny at all and not rosy. It's on anti-black racism, actually on racist attacks. And she starts the article with the case of 2 young women who had been killed, actually, in such an attack. And then she talks appreciatively on a white celebrity whose name I didn't know, which is a problem on my side. So, but who has posted on this event? So Packnett writes, as I've said before, white privilege isn't a curse word, but rather a term that describes an unfair game. White privilege is a status afforded by a system designated by white people with white people in mind. Like it or not, we are all born into that system. Race is not the only privilege you can have, but it is the most powerful. So if you're white, how can you help remedy this situation? Begin to spend your privilege. You didn't earn it, so give it away. And then she asks what could be done to do that. And she says, so how can you spend your privilege and invest it in something good? Using social media to spread awareness about underrepresented issues is a fine start. In gender studies, there is the term hashtag activism for this. But she's also talking about challenging the media, challenging the police. And also she's suggesting reading black women's work. And then she says, as you learn, share what you know with other people of privilege, unburdening those of us already oppressed from doing that work. As you do this, apply a similar series of actions to issues of justice where you live, work, play, and worship. And then she says the most important thing is what is on the slide before, train yourself toward solidarity and not charity. I find this quite interesting because it's sort of a popular culture take on this complex relation, and it seems quite easy to do this, I would say, at least theoretically, but I would, and I think she has a point, but I think there's a bit more than sharing your privilege by doing, or maybe there's more to be said about the relationship between solidarity and charity than what she says there. And this is particularly the case when we perceive that relation or these notions, or we understand them with relation to social inequality and hence material issues. And this is what I will address now on the relationship between solidarity and charity. If we look at current normative critical literature on solidarity, we quickly come across positions that clearly distinguish solidarity from charity and do this for good reasons. The aforementioned Shirin Rai, the one who problematized hands-off, for instance, emphasizes that, quote, solidarity is not beneficence or charity, but a symmetrical relationship between individuals whose visions of the good life coalesce into similar political forms. Symmetry is not in the PACNet one, right? This is, the PACNet one is people who have privilege who use it and share it. German philosopher Rahel Yegi develops the notion of solidarity related to symmetrical and reciprocal relations and distinguishes solidarity from compassion, helpfulness, and humanitarian aid, which, according to her, always the latter refer to asymmetrical relationships and thus hence cannot be solidarity. And another example, sociologist Silke van Dijk argues with regard to the social question, and that's regarding possibilities to institutionalize material forms of solidarity in favor of a, quote, decoupling of social security and social relationships through the granting of social rights, for example, in social insurance systems, even though historically these were for male wage workers only, end of quote. Not only at first sight, such splits of solidarity from asymmetries and from one-sided personalized dependency make much sense. However, it must be asked, or I'd like to ask, and I'm actually grappling with this and I'm very curious what you will say afterwards, or maybe you will say something, I'm curious. I'd like to ask how far such splits hold when we consider contexts where state systems of social security, such as the ones we know from Europe, do not exist for the majority of the population and presumably will not exist in the foreseeable future, where even male workers can rarely count on social benefits granted by the state, and where in cases of emergency, like severe health problems, one must hope that either the family or wealthy patrons step in. I would say this is the case in Pakistan, for instance. What is at stake here is the significance, the applicability of the outlined concepts of solidarity for contexts where social security is almost always linked to social relations and thus potentially to social control or to constellations of interpersonal asymmetry, and against this background, perhaps not inevitably, but nevertheless frequently, also to hierarchy. A possible answer to sort of this, however, question may be that the analytic and normative distinction between solidarity and welfare proves particularly helpful in such cases. Because on the ground of this distinction, contexts in which people may depend on family or patrons can be described as unsolidaristic, as deficient, or even as pre-modern, at best as a mechanical rather than an organic form of solidarity, as Durkheim would have it. It must be noted, however, that such a characterization is clearly reminiscent of Western discourse on progress and development that has been used for colonial purposes for centuries. I would therefore be a bit hesitant in adopting it. But then such hesitation is far from unproblematic either, for the lowering of normative claims with reference to the others also follows a colonial logic, as it is a primary formula for justifying something that one might call solidarity problematically could be called something else. And an example of what I mean is it's also a Pakistan, or sort of my Pakistan experiences case, a middle-class professional who makes it possible for her live-in housekeeper's daughter to attend the same expensive private school where she has sent her own children. With reference to Durkheim, we may call this situation mechanical solidarity and thus an ultimately pre-modern form of solidarity. But alternatively, we may also speak of kinship in this case, of kinship in a broad, non-biological sense, or simply a relationship of care in the context of a private household. After all, the benefits that children receive from their parents would hardly be called solidarity benefits either. However, such a strategy would simply, in a way, I would think, define away the problem outlined before, it would not really solve the question of possible limits of a clear distinction between solidarity and charity in contexts in which solidarity in the sense of state institutionalized social security cannot be counted with and is always provided by the family, patrons, or other hierarchical social institutions. Perhaps the question of solidarity and charity cannot be answered in a general way. Perhaps it's presumptuous to claim that we can actually formulate universal answers to the difficult question of solidarity practice in context of inequality, and maybe those of us in relatively privileged positions are particularly unfit for such attempts at clarifying this theoretically. Perhaps these questions can at best be answered situationally and moreover collectively, dialogically, by those affected in each case, rather than by distance theorists. Postcolonial theories point in such a direction. Among the most important references in this regard is undoubtedly Gayatri Spivak, who published her topical reflections as early as the 1980s. It is true that the concept of solidarity doesn't play a very major role in her work, but in her famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, as well as in a series of texts dealing with international women's and gender politics, Spivak repeatedly addresses good ways of interaction between Western activists and the subaltern in the global South. Almost across the board, these ways of interaction are dialogical. On the one hand, Spivak criticizes the silencing of the subaltern by not taking their perspectives and articulation seriously. On the other hand, she problematizes the romanticization of the subaltern, the idea that a Western scholar or activist only needs to listen to them and is already provided with an authentic, immediately comprehensible alternative truth that is free of ideology and other social discourse effects. Rather, to Spivak, it's necessary to enter into dialogical interactions. The prerequisite for this, in turn, is modesty, both in terms of content and with regard to the mode of interaction. For a common learning effect is hardly conceivable if the conversation amounts to an exchange of prefabricated convictions. In this context, Spivak suggests for Western and hence often comparatively privileged dialogue partners to try to perceive their privileges or the privileges that come with their situation as an epistemological limitation rather than an advantage. And she suggests to unlearn these privileges. Unlearning our privilege as our loss is her own formula for this. From this, she derives a twofold task. On the one hand, a good preparation in terms of content, or, to quote her, to do our homework, to work hard at gaining some knowledge of the others who occupy those spaces most close to our privileged due. And on the other hand, special measures and efforts directed at the possibility of actual understanding, or how the Spivak editors Landry and MacLean put it, attempting to speak to those others in such a way that they might take us seriously and, most important of all, be able to answer back. What is needed, therefore, is a genuine dialogical interest, the willingness to be challenged, to question one's own presuppositions and thought patterns, and, if necessary, to revise them. And furthermore, a difference-conscious and power-sensitive mode of interaction without gestures of superiority or missionary paternalistic intentions. I would claim, and maybe I make enemies now or whatever, that political theory as a field is pretty much doing the opposite. I mean, in a way, it's about trying to be smarter than others because we have more time to think through stuff. So Spivak is in a way saying, no, don't attempt at knowing it better all the time, even though you are super smart and you spend a lot of time in the libraries. So I think this is actually a pretty big challenge, or can be. Ultimately then, it's a matter of taking each other seriously. Yeah, for Spivak, solidarity emerges in dialogue under recognition of difference. Solidarity comes from exchange of information and a bonding through acknowledgement of difference, she writes. This implies that for Spivak, a certain degree of reciprocity and a symmetrical dialogue, and thus interaction for Spivak, as actually for Yegi, a certain degree of reciprocity and a symmetrical dialogue and thus interaction situation are indeed central components of solidarity. However, this doesn't mean that solidarity is dependent on any kind of homogeneity of those who interact with each other in solidarity. For Spivak, differences are not the limit of solidarity, but a moment that must be reckoned with. Therefore, with regard to relations of solidarity, symmetry should not be presupposed by definition, but established in concrete interaction. Responsible for this task are those who are comparatively privileged and who therefore could presumably more easily afford to do without the relationship of solidarity in question. What this might mean in a practical sense can be illustrated, I think, by reference to 2 interviews with staff members of projects and organizations with a transnational solidarity claim that have been conducted by Lea Susemichel and Jens Kastner for one of the books I mentioned at the very beginning that came out in the last years in German on solidarity. The book is called Unbedingte Solidarität, which would translate into unconditional solidarity. So Susemichel and Kastner interviewed the editors of the journal Lateinamerika Nachrichten, which is basically Latin American news, which is a journal dedicated to critical reporting on the socio-political situation as well as on social movements in Latin American countries. It started off from Chile's solidarity groups. So to the editors, such critical solidarity is not, what they claim is an attitude of critical solidarity. And this is a term that has actually been coined by people in the sort of German Nicaragua solidarity movement during the Sandinista time, the first Sandinista time, the revolutionary Sandinista time. So to them, such critical solidarity is not blind loyalty, but the movement and to the movement and actors they support, but an attempt to use their own privileges in solidarity. They write, say in this interview, because we identify with many of their goals and often have common goals, we use the resources we have here, be it security or international attention, to support their struggles in which we recognize ourselves or which are also ours. And they go on, even if our work in the editorial office is unpaid and we consider this as being part of our solidarity practice, isn't this only possible because we have free time to do so, and not maybe have to work 3 jobs? But we work for a common goal despite unequal premises, context, conditions, overcoming inequality. So while, to go back a step for half a sentence, Spivak is interested in successful solidarity interactions that overcome massive status differences, the editorial staff of Lateinamerika Nachrichten is interested in journalistic action in which the overcoming of inequality can be seen as the common goal of all participants, be it the editorial staff, the authors, or the activists in Latin American countries whose concerns and activities are reported on in the magazine. But here too, the process is already part of the goal. They say, non-paternalistic solidarity would be for us a mutual process of learning and exchange with a common perspective of liberation or equality, to relate to other struggles out of our own struggles, and through relating to each other to know what kind of solidarity is desired and welcomed from Europe, from us. In contrast to common practice in the field, so I would actually claim that this is different from what Pecknett suggests, because she doesn't necessarily suggest this kind of interaction. And also in contrast to common practice in the field of development aid organized by large donor organizations, the editors of Latin America Nachrichten find it important to refrain from formulating the concrete steps of their solidarity interaction themselves, but to let them, they suggest in practice to let them emerge in dialogue. The coalition model, solidarity without identity. When looking for theoretical reflections of solidarity that take power, differences, and inequality into account, and that are based on concrete experience, it is worthwhile to take a look at the archives of feminism. Here, an understanding of solidarity that is based on homogeneity, on common subordination, or possibly even on a notion of global sisterhood has been critically discussed for a long time. A particularly prominent critic of the sisterhood model is Chandra Mohanty. In her essay, Feminist Encounters, Locating the Politics of Experience, from 1992, also an old text, Mohanty starts off problematizing the basic assumption that the sisterhood model is based on, namely a global correlation of experiences and women's interests, perspectives, and political goals that would derive from them. According to Mohanty, this assumption arises from viewing feminism as an osmotic effect of women's experiences rather than as a heterogeneous and thoroughly conflictual field of politics. She calls this approach, not without irony, the feminist osmosis thesis, which goes, females are feminists by association and identification with experiences which constitute us as female. She problematizes this, claiming that women are not necessarily feminists. Mohanty considers the osmosis thesis problematic for two reasons. First, experiences of Western feminists are generalized and thus elevated to female experiences with a universal claim of validity, at least in a lot of sort of older, earlier global feminism approaches, while context-specific deviations from this norm would be faded out or even condemned. And second, and at the same time, women are reduced to their femininity with regard to their interests and political goals. In Mohanty's eyes, this reduction falls far too short. She holds that women's experiences are shaped by more components than femininity alone and are often fragmented by the interplay and frictions of various influences and affiliations. Because of these fragmentations, Mohanty considers deriving feminist goals from female experiences insufficient for the creation of a global feminist project. I quote her, "Sisterhood cannot be assumed on the basis of gender. It must be forged in concrete historical and political practice and analysis." She had written in an earlier essay already, and in this one that I've been addressing, Feminist Encounters, she writes, I quote once more, "For me, the unity of women," and this you have on the slide, "the unity of women is best understood not as given on the basis of a natural psychological commonality. It is something that has to be worked for, struggled toward in history. What we need to do is articulate ways in which the historical forms of oppression relate to the category women and not to try to deduce one from the other." According to Mohanty, a feminist project that aims at the emancipation of women cannot be limited to anti-patriarchal struggle. It is, she says, the current intersection of anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and gay and lesbian struggles that we need to understand to map the ground for feminist political strategy and critical analysis. Against the backdrop of these intersections of political struggles, Mohanty is certainly in favor of thematically focused international feminist networks, for example on issues like sex tourism or the exploitation of female labor. However, she explicitly distinguishes these from the idea of a unified international women's movement that works on the basis of the implicit assumption of global sisterhood. To describe the organizational principles of such thematically oriented and precisely not identity-based associations, Mohanty adopts Bernice Johnson Reagan's concept of coalition. Her interest in coalitions focuses on conflicts within heterogeneous political groups rather than on commonalities as in the sisterhood concepts and other forms of identity politics. Reagan wrote very important, very early, sort of very influential things from an African-American feminist perspective. So Mohanty quotes Reagan, "You don't go into coalition because you like it. The only reason you would consider trying to team up with someone who could possibly kill you is because that's the only way you can figure you can stay alive." The heterogeneous, one could also say intersectional, feminist coalitions that both have in mind, Reagan and Mohanty, are thus communities of purpose. In Germany it would be Zweckgemeinschaften. No less, but also no more. It's not based on sisterhood, but basically you have no other choice. I come to the end. Starting with problems of the implementation of solidarity in contexts marked by inequality, I've discussed demands, problematizations, and purposes, and proposed solutions for solidarity in the post-colonial and thus globalized world. With Fanon, I've introduced the idea of colonial reparations in the sense of a moral duty of Europe, not in the sense of alms granted voluntarily. With reference to the micro level, I've furthermore discussed two problems associated with solidaristic relations in context of inequality: the danger of becoming imperial on the one hand, and the fluid boundary, or possibly fluid boundary, between solidaristic and charitable action on the other hand. I've tried to show that in the case of both problems, standard answers are not always convincing. Finally, using dialogical interaction practices and the concept of coalition developed in the context of feminist theorizing, instead of solidarity in the sense of sisterhood, I have presented proposals on how to deal with solidarity problems on the micro level, not in the sense of patent solutions for the problems discussed, but in the sense of procedures that open up possibilities for action in which said problems are counted with as a constant danger. Solidarity-based action thus doesn't become an easy task, but in context of inequality, it will probably never be. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Ina. It was amazing. Very interesting presentation. Very challenging question for us, how to think about how to produce solidarity in such an unequal world. Well, usually the first rounds of questions are open to the students. And after that, we open to the other part of the audience. So, who would like to ask some question? The students. You don't need to be shy. Oh, okay, Gustavo.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask about the relation you see between what you term the radical humanism of Fanon and the coalition politics of Mohanty, because as I see it, it's kind of like Fanon starts from a category of human to criticize coloniality, whereas Mohanty says that the category of woman is something to be strived for. It's not the beginning of the critique, but maybe a coalition effort. So theoretically, how do you see the difference between these two approaches? Thank you.
Should I answer?
Just to see if you have another one, maybe, or not yet. Okay, so Ina, please.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. I would I would say that both of them have a bit different starting points. I know that Fanon is being read currently in very different ways. I read him as a critical humanist, and that is against backdrop of the dehumanization of black people by colonialism, which to him, the way I read him, and I'm not alone, and in a way you have to. It's still a big challenge in a way in the world that every person is granted the same humanity, that everyone counts actually the same. It's easy to say everybody counts the same, but if you look at the world, the practice looks very, very much differently. So this idea of a radicalization of humanism means that everybody is actually counted in. And that might be the precondition for starting solidaristic coalitional work. And I wouldn't say that Mohanty, or I hope I didn't say that Mohanty says that the notion of woman should be strived for, but a notion of what it means to be, or a notion of feminist goals. They shouldn't be presupposed. It shouldn't be, it shouldn't be that a particular issue like wage differences or abortion rights should be assumed to be the most important feminism issue for every single person who identifies as a feminist in the world. For some feminists, it might be racism. For some feminists, it might be transphobia. For some, it might be all sorts of different things. It could also be social inequality. And if you look at literature from international feminist debates, there was often striking differences in priorities from voiced by activists from different contexts. And this is what she problematizes. Yeah. So it's the political goals that have to be strived for. And of course, universalizing humanism in the Fanonian sense is also a political goal, but this isn't one I guess he would want to need, or would want to. It's on a different ground than assessing what feminist priorities should be. Yeah.
Wait. Another question from the students. You have some time to think about some questions. Okay, we could open to the general public,
and
maybe.
Do ask comprehension questions in case you have any, because I can imagine, because I'm not all of you are familiar probably with the gender studies literature, and I know that there was a lot of name dropping and everything, so please ask.
Please.
I would like to ask for the other term that you use, not solidarity but charity, and you also mentioned compassion. So there's charity and compassion, and of course these two terms are still used by Christian worldviews, and I would like to know if you see any space for these terms in the disciplines of social studies or politics. Do they have any space left, or are they impossible because they always imply a position of hierarchy, and there's no possibility to be charitable or compassionate without establishing this hierarchy? Do you see any space for these terms?
We have another one.
Yeah.
Would you like to? Yeah, we could.
Yeah.
You can have the second one. Okay. Yeah.
I hope you can combine it because it's kind of a follow-up question. Because I was intrigued by your comment on compassion, and also because in all these relational, say, concepts like solidarity, we are often assuming humans as acting in solidarity, two parties, so to say, that have agency. I've been teaching a course on solidarity in Berlin last year. So Solidaridade com Chão, and I think in context of climate crisis, it's very interesting to think about more than human solidarity. And I know that there is quite an interesting feminist literature, Maria Puig de la Casa, Vandana Shiva, who think about solidarity also in this more than human way. But I was also always wondering, how can solidarity look like if we go beyond human agency, and maybe something like compassion or affect can be terms. You talked about bonding as well, so maybe I would be curious if you had any reflections in this direction. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, Ina.
Hello.
Thanks. My question is related to, how these ideas about critical solidarity, the coalition model, whether and if and to which extent it is in dialogue, let's say, to the internationalist movement of 20th century socialism, communism, and to which extent it distinguishes itself, to what contributions it makes, and also whether it actually it's to some extent critical in dialogue, also to some extent of the failure of the female male worker solidarity, global solidarity, which to some extent pumped into the issue of global inequality in terms of economic interests, when you think about the different working class interests in the global south and global north. Thank you.
Okay. There's a.
What do you think? It's related to this one.
Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. It's a little bit related to Chris's question because you were using institutionalized social security as kind of this model for what solidarity could be. And I was thinking of other models of solidarity that the international workers' solidarity, and I was thinking third world solidarity also. I know they simplify a little bit of the things because there's maybe third world solidarity, there's no so much the preoccupation with inequality or hierarchy. But if you work those into, I think there's Antenor Firmin that talks about solidarity, the third world solidarity, and the work of, I'm name dropping too, sorry, Prashad, if you have thought of how to integrate those.
Thank you so much. Hard ones. And I don't know if I can answer them all, but I have noted them down, and I have half a year now. I can think about things. Is there space for charity in social sciences? I don't know actually, and it's hard. It's hard to answer this. Where are you? Here. The thing is, I guess one would have to answer your question properly. One would have to distinguish where, right? So in normative theorizing, I don't even know if I would like it there that much, because I don't know if I do like it that much. I totally sympathize with those who say it's much better because much more liberating to have an anonymous, in terms of material solidarity, Solidarsystem in German, a state-run solidary system, and you have rights, and it's anonymous, and the state gives you what you need in situations of whatever health or other problems, and it's not a personalized relation. I mean, this is my position, you know. I have these rights in Germany, and I'm very happy about them. So I was in Pakistan, and these don't exist, you know. And everybody who has money gives away stuff, and in a way, I was grappling with this, and not with the giving away, but with the fact that there is no way away from these, there seems to be no way away from these very hierarchical systems, whether it's your family, whether it's a patron. When you're poor, it's a patron. Even when you're rich, it's your family. And you cannot just say goodbye to your family. I don't like you. I do my own thing, because you need them. And that is, I think, a problem. But what I find problematic as well, and this is what I try to think through here, and probably it didn't work, but in a way, often in normative theorizing, we think, yes, we need, a good social system. That's easy to want. But in so many cases, it's not easy to or unlikely to be institutionalized. And then, in a way, it seems like this normative claim is almost an offense, because in a when it's applied to situations in which what you normally find right is unlikely to be achieved. And this is what I try to grapple with. And I think there is I would say, Eurocentrism in normative theorizing that has very good reasons behind it, reasons that I hold myself, but nevertheless, I think there is a problem. And then the question is how to think differently about these other relations. One solution would be, or maybe solution, to not find them as problematic, and on a normative ground. But then, of course, one, I guess, should study them. And this is then a different way charity could come more into social sciences. I don't actually know that much about how much it is in social sciences and how much people study charity. What I do know is that in many cases where neoliberalism has made social security run by the state go down, churches stepped in, and particularly evangelical ones. This is happening all over the place, and this must be studied, I think also it must be problematized, but I think one should speak about it. This is, I guess, what I can say on this. Laura, thank you. Of course, solidarity should go beyond humans, clearly. And I didn't address this at all here, but it makes sense to speak about it in that way. And compassion would probably be something that is helpful there, and one could probably also say that a lot of climate activists are very compassionate, and this is what drives them into activism. But I think this is a little bit of a different debate. Not less important or so, but another set of problems. One could include animals and as well. The Christa, hello. The communism question, or the sort of socialist ideas. I think these ideas and these movements are extremely important, and I'd like to see them flourish everywhere. But while they haven't flourished, I think the problem that I tried to just address is still there. And what I try to think about is how to deal with this in a way. And to say we need a revolution is, of course, true, but till it comes, the problems are there, and I think it's not enough to say, I tend to think it's not enough to say it's a deficient context. Third world solidarity, thank you. What I tried to do with this Latin American Studies News example is exactly that, of course. So I tried to integrate it, and a lot of global feminism could be said to be into this kind of work as well, right? But I think that from what I know about this Lateinamerika Nachrichten journal, they do a pretty good job in trying to reflect the power relations that are in this field and try to work in a pretty good way with the people on the ground in the countries where the journal is about. And but it probably makes sense to look at other areas of that kind of work to find more good practice, maybe also not so good practice, but sort of ideas and reflections on this. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. We have another round of questions, beginning with Marta, please.
Thanks for your lecture. Maybe both my English and my ignorance on the subject, I risk not being clear, but I'll try anyway. My first question is a clarification one. It refers to the ambition or the scope of the proposal. Does it refers to international relations, or does it refers to domestic institutions? Does it refers to legislation, or does it refer to interpersonal relations? It ends up not very clear for me, and this is a clarification question. And I think this is very important for the issue of the move from charity to solidarity. I'm a person who has worked on the welfare state literature for a long time, and the welfare state literature has a clear answer to your question. So, charity is on the domain of moral duties, and a moral duty of mine does not translate into a right for you. And we have solidarity when you have rights, and your rights does not depend on interpersonal relations. It translates into law, and it does not depend on an unilateral decision of mine. So it's not on the domain of interpersonal relations, but it's on the domain of legislation, law, and people's rights. And so the problem turns out to be who is eligible for A, B, or C. Also, and so what's the design of policies? And which institution will enforce these policies? And there is a long debate between international rights and national rights. So, so if I were to answer you from the point of view of the welfare state literature, the answer would be there is no problem. Charity translates into solidarity when your demands are strong enough to translate into law. And the problem is not anymore on the normative literature, but is a politics bargain. But again, it's hard for me with this background to understand what's the let's say the ambition of the proposal, the scope of the proposal. Thanks.
Yeah. Should I answer?
And we have two more.
Yeah.
Can I?
Okay.
Can I
Yeah.
take it? Manuel, please.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is a bit of clarification as well. So I didn't quite understand how you went from Fanon, talking about reparations, to the problem of solidarity and charity, and you ended with coalition as a solution. I'm sorry. It was my time to speak. So I'm asking this because it doesn't seem like solidarity, charity, or coalitions can provide reparations, right? And it seems like if we kept working on how can we get European states to, in fact, provide reparations to former colonies, and perhaps this would help to solve a lot of the problems, and then the discussion about coalitions, etc., would not be there in the first place. So I understand that you made the link by we have to appeal to civil society, but it connects with Martha's question, because it seems to me that civil society would have to demand, say, reparations from their governments, right? And it would be a riot. So I didn't understand how we were talking about reparations and this translated into a problem of distinguishing solidarity and charity and proposing coalitions as a solution. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And the other one.
Hi, I'm Alina. Thank you for your presentation. I have a conceptual question, I think. You used the term coloniality during your presentation, and I would like to know if you use this term in agreement, actually according to the Latin American authors from the modernity coloniality agenda, such as Minolo, Quijano, Dussel, coloniality of power, knowledge. And if the answer is no, which approach do you use? Thank you.
Okay. Shall I? Yeah. Okay, I'll start with the last question. The answer is yes. I'm a fan of Quijanos. I'm not such a fan of Mignolos, but that's a different paper, a different debate. The other questions, I was a bit afraid before presenting here because I knew that it's a sort of proper political science institute colloquium, and people will ask questions like the ones you asked, and you have very good reasons for asking them. I start with your question. In a way, you might find this a weak answer, but anyway, I didn't try to present a coherent proposal. And I sort of, in the very first slide, it says 5 fragments and an and. It is actually fragments. What I did when I put this together, or first wrote this German article, I looked through post-colonial studies literature and sort of thought about where do people address solidarity. And it is sort of fragments that are not really fitting. I mean, yeah, there are some actually some links, but they are very loose. And what I'd like to do, among the things I'd like to do in the next months, is to think about this in a more severe way. I mean, I do think that, I can say this. I mean, what one could say, for instance, is that Fanon's call for reparations is not met by development politics, and the sort of third world solidarity movements in the global north are also pretty different from development politics, even though people working in these development organizations, I was once doing an internship in one in Nicaragua in the late 90s, and a lot of people working there with the German GIZ, they were former solidarity movement people and had been picking cotton with the Sandinista youth. So it's also a bit, it's not so easy to say these are the good guys and these are the bad ones often, and these are the good practices and these are the bad ones, and these are the good institutions and these are the bad ones, because it totally depends on who's doing what And it's worthwhile to have a closer look at this. But on the bottom line, these organizations have they create their agendas in the donor offices. But thank you for your question. So there's a lot of loose ends. Concerning your question, which is also very valid, is it international relations or domestic things? I would say both, and there were parts that were rather on international relations and parts that were rather on sort of domestic ones. And you are also right that parts were on rather, say, interpersonal relations and others were on more institutionalized questions. But if you look at, by writing this one part, I always had this Pakistan lack of social security systems example in mind. It's sometimes not so easy, or it challenged the way I thought about the relationship between charity and social security. I'm a big old fan of Nancy Fraser's, who has been written on these issues very early on and problematized the welfare system in the US and argued heavily in favor of a European-style social security system in which you have rights and entitlements to a particular Leistung, whatever. Yeah, benefits, and she problematizes, and I totally follow her on this. The charity aspects of welfare in the US, where the social worker comes and checks for whether you're a good mother or you're tidy or whatever. I find this, as she does, repressive. The thing is, in Pakistan, you have these institutionalized forms of charity. There is the zakat system, which sometimes in literature is translated as a solidarity tax. So basically, there is a sort of religious obligation to pay this alms tax, tax-like charity. So I think this is an interesting case in which the clear distinction that we sort of know from the Western tradition doesn't really work the same way as we know it and as we like it, and as we and it works in a way in which this clear distinction and also clear solutions, as you say, and as I agree with you, they don't really work that way. And not only because it seems unlikely, very, very unfortunately, that sound social systems are institutionalized soon. The tax system doesn't even work well. Hardly anyone is paying taxes. Most people are. The majority of people in informal labor is tremendous, and so not only because of this sort of the institutionalization problem, the practical problem, but also because there are cultural practices and cultural institutions that are different from state institutions, but still in place that in a way blur this boundary. And that I find interesting when we think about, say, the post-colonial world. Yeah.
Talita, please.
Hi, Professor Ina. I'd like to thank you. And it is more a curiosity that I have. Whereas you were speaking, you said that political theory must be cooperative, working in terms that we must not just address subject, and we must not just act as if we were more intelligent regarding the amount of theories we know. And in this sense, it means that we need a more cooperative work. And by doing this, I'd like to ask how it has been your experience in terms of exchange when you come in different countries, like Brazil, for instance. Do you see that there is any asymmetrical relation between you and other researches, and how do you think it has been this experience for you in terms of building political theory and also in terms of thinking solidarity? Do you think how is the environment? It's just a curiosity.
Thank you. That's a difficult one. It would be easy for me to say I just came 2 days ago, so don't know yet. It's true that I just came 2 days ago, but I've been here before. I don't know, really. What I do know is that, particularly in Brazil, everybody looks at Europe and thinks that, I mean, this is what Brazilian colleagues who'd been in Koblenz told me, that everybody looks to Europe and thinks that the academic system there would be so great. I would say I'm not so sure. I think, we look at the United States, everybody wants to go there. We all know that USP is a very prestigious place in Brazil, much better funded than my university, for instance. So I don't really know if I can answer your question that well, and I don't know if one can answer it on a general level. Definitely there are knowledge hierarchies in the world, and they're a problem. Some are, I think, result from colonial education and history. Some result from financing of educational institutions. Usually those with much more money have not necessarily more interesting research. Often the rich ones are the most, in a way, conservative, in the sense of them preserving the knowledge that is already there and not really trying to be so innovative. And at least in the social sciences. So there are different factors that come into play, and I guess it depends a lot on whom you interact with. Yeah, that's, I guess, what I can say.
Another question. There's another one. Okay. Maybe this is the last round of questions, considering our deadline. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Kerner, for your lecture. I like it, particularly the way you defined solidarity. But I want to go back to the beginning of your presentation to ask something about your methodological choices. Yeah. Is it possible to analyze international and feminist solidarity adopting a national methodological nationalist approach? Just say thank you very much.
Okay. Methodological nationalism is not a term that I coined. It's been around for a while, and it actually means that scholarship is done, and the fact that the reference frame for that scholarship is a nation state is not really often is in a way presupposed, So and the critique has come up in a way against the backdrop of the idea that we have globalization now, and one should think at stuff and look at issues that we study from a, say, transnational perspective, but that often this is not being done, and it's not reflected upon that it's not being done. So this is methodological nationalism. It's a term that is being used. It's a normative term that problematizes something. So I try to what I said at the beginning was that I think that a lot of the solidarity debates currently happening, at least in Germany, at least in these books and at these conferences and so forth, that they are driven by methodological nationalism, and that is a problem. I don't say that it doesn't make a lot of sense to think about issues of solidarity on very many levels, including a local one, including a regional one, including a national one, including a regional one in the sense of, say, a region like, say, South America or whatever, you know, regions can be subnational and supranational. But so all of this makes sense, but one should say, yeah, it also makes sense to say which level one thinks about. So I think, yeah, so of course, if you adopt methodological nationalism, you cannot really speak, you would not really speak about international and global affairs. I do know, or I sort of was worrying, or I'm still worrying, or I'm wondering whether what I present in a way is pretty much driven from, say, a northern perspective. That can be, or probably it is the case, and I need to think about what I do with that. Yeah.
Okay. So, Ina, I would like to thank you very much again for the presentation, for the discussion. We are looking forward to seeing you and discussing with you again here at the Department of Political Science very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Muito obrigada a ustedes. It was extremely helpful for me. Thank you so much. There is a lot of work ahead of me that I know now even more than before. But well, that's the business. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, very interesting.
Thank you.
Challenging.